Prophecy Decoded. Decoded the past, reveal the future.
My friends, what I'm about to reveal will shake your understanding of biblical history to its very core. After decades of studying ancient manuscripts and archaeological evidence, I've uncovered a shocking truth that mainstream scholars have systematically ignored or deliberately suppressed. The women prophets of the Hebrew Israelites were not merely local religious figures confined to ancient Palestine. They were powerful spiritual leaders whose influence shaped the entire global diaspora of God's chosen people. And their prophetic voices continue to echo through end-times prophecy today. In my decades of researching these ancient texts, I've never encountered evidence quite like this. The Hebrew Israelites revered prophets as God's direct messengers. Yet women prophets like Miriam, Deborah, and Huldah have been overshadowed in traditional biblical history narratives. Have you ever wondered why these powerful voices have been muted in our understanding of ancient Israel? What absolutely stunned me about this discovery is how their roles connect directly to end-time signs and modern Hebrew Israelite identity debates across the globe. The implications of what we're exploring today are staggering. Exodus 20 explicitly names Miriam as a prophetess. Judges 4 elevates Deborah as both judge and prophet, and 2 Kings 22 honors Huldah's divine counsel to kings. These weren't peripheral figures in Hebrew Israelite society. They were central to God's prophetic plan for His chosen people, and their influence may have extended far beyond the borders of ancient Palestine. What strikes me most powerfully is how these women's stories resonate with African American narratives of resilience and spiritual leadership, while simultaneously drawing all viewers into the universal mystery of biblical secrets. The mainstream biblical scholarship establishment views these prophetesses as local figures limited to specific historical contexts, but alternative perspectives suggest their influence reached scattered Hebrew Israelite tribes across the globe, possibly leaving cultural and spiritual markers that persist to this day. This isn't just about ancient history. This is about understanding your place in God's prophetic timeline as we approach the end times. The voices of these forgotten women prophets may hold the key to understanding the global Hebrew Israelite diaspora and its connection to biblical prophecy that's unfolding right before our eyes in 2025. The controversy surrounding these women prophets sparks intense debate within biblical scholarship circles. While mainstream historians emphasize their localized historical context, alternative voices, particularly within African American communities, recognize them as evidence of Hebrew Israelite global influence that predates known historical migrations. Ancient prophecy in Micah 6:4 lists Miriam alongside Moses and Aaron, hinting at her significance in ways that traditional scholarship has failed to fully explore. Could their prophetic words have guided scattered Hebrew Israelite tribes across continents? Could their spiritual authority have influenced the cultural development of dispersed communities that maintained Hebrew traditions for millennia? The archaeological evidence and DNA evidence we'll examine today suggests possibilities that challenge everything we thought we knew about ancient migrations and cultural transmission. This exploration avoids divisive frameworks while fostering genuine dialogue about biblical secrets that have been hidden for centuries. We're celebrating African American heritage while engaging all audiences with end-time signs that point to the ultimate fulfillment of God's prophetic plan. The women prophets of the Hebrew Israelites weren't just historical curiosities. They were divine instruments preparing the way for revelations that speak directly to our current moment in prophetic history. Let me share something that has revolutionized my understanding of Hebrew Israelite identity and biblical prophecy. When I first encountered Miriam's designation as a prophetess in Exodus 15:20, I was struck by how this title places her in the same category as Moses and Aaron in terms of divine authority. Miriam wasn't just Moses' sister who happened to be present at significant events. She was a prophetess who led the Hebrew Israelites in worship after their miraculous Red Sea crossing, and her prophetic role may have extended far beyond what traditional biblical history acknowledges. The Hebrew text makes it clear that Miriam possessed the same divine calling as her brothers, yet mainstream biblical scholarship has consistently minimized her influence. What absolutely fascinates me is how Micah 6:4 places Miriam alongside Moses and Aaron as one of 3 leaders whom God sent to bring the Hebrew Israelites out of Egypt. This suggests her prophetic authority was recognized throughout Hebrew Israelite communities, not just during the Exodus period but for generations afterward. Have you ever wondered why Miriam's prophetic song in Exodus 15:21 shares striking similarities with African oral traditions? The call and response pattern, the emphasis on divine deliverance, and the celebration of God's power over earthly authorities resonate deeply with African American worship traditions. This parallel suggests that Hebrew Israelite cultural patterns may have influenced or been preserved within African diaspora communities in ways that DNA evidence is now beginning to confirm. Alternative scholars argue that Miriam's oracles and prophetic insights guided Hebrew Israelite tribal migrations beyond the immediate Exodus narrative. Her spiritual authority may have shaped the cultural identity of scattered tribes, particularly those that eventually settled in African regions where Hebrew traditions persisted for centuries. This perspective challenges the mainstream view that limits her influence to a specific historical moment and geographic location. The prophetic tradition that Miriam established among Hebrew Israelite women created a legacy that would influence spiritual leadership for generations. Her role as the first-named prophetess in biblical history established precedents for female spiritual authority that would manifest in figures like Deborah and Huldah. This tradition of women's prophetic leadership may have been particularly influential in Hebrew Israelite communities that maintained their cultural identity while dispersed among other nations. When we examine Deborah's extraordinary role in Judges 4 and 5, we encounter a Hebrew Israelite woman who combined prophetic authority with political leadership in ways that transformed ancient Israel. Deborah wasn't just a prophetess who delivered divine messages. She was a judge who held court under the palm Deborah and directed military campaigns that secured Hebrew Israelite territorial control. Her prophetic song in Judges 5 represents one of the most powerful pieces of biblical prophecy in the Hebrew Scriptures. What absolutely stunned me about Deborah's leadership is how it challenges conventional assumptions about gender roles in Hebrew Israelite society. She exercised authority over male military leaders, made strategic decisions that determined the fate of entire tribes, and composed prophetic literature that has inspired spiritual warriors for millennia. Her story demonstrates that Hebrew Israelite women could hold the highest levels of spiritual and political authority when called by God for such roles. The geographic scope of Deborah's influence extended throughout the tribal territories of ancient Israel, but alternative scholars suggest her prophetic authority may have shaped Hebrew Israelite identity beyond the immediate Canaanite context. Her emphasis on divine deliverance, tribal and resistance to foreign oppression established themes that would resonate with scattered Hebrew Israelite communities facing similar challenges in diaspora settings. Deborah's prophetic song celebrates not just military victory but the cosmic significance of God's intervention on behalf of His chosen people. This theological framework provided Hebrew Israelite communities with a spiritual template for understanding their struggles against oppressive forces throughout history. The themes of divine justice, tribal solidarity, and ultimate victory over enemies became central to Hebrew Israelite identity, particularly within communities that maintained their cultural distinctiveness while living among other peoples. The warrior prophetess tradition that Deborah embodied may have influenced Hebrew Israelite women's roles in scattered communities across Africa, Europe, and other regions. Her example of combining spiritual authority with practical leadership provided a model for women who found themselves in positions of community leadership within diaspora Hebrew Israelite populations. This tradition of strong female spiritual leadership resonates particularly powerfully with African American experiences of women's roles in religious and community contexts. Huldah's prophetic ministry in 2 Kings 22:14-20 represents one of the most politically significant examples of women's prophetic authority in biblical history. When King Josiah discovered the Book of the Law in the temple, he sent his highest officials not to male prophets like Jeremiah or Zephaniah, but to Huldah for divine authentication and interpretation. Her prophetic oracle validated the discovered text and sparked the most comprehensive religious reform in Hebrew Israelite history. What moves me most deeply about Huldah's story is how it demonstrates the ultimate spiritual authority that Hebrew Israelite women could wield. Kings and high priests recognized her as God's spokesperson, and her prophetic words carried the weight of divine revelation that could reshape entire kingdoms. Her role in validating the Book of the Law may have established precedents for scriptural authentication that influenced how Hebrew Israelite communities preserved and transmitted their sacred texts. The timing of Huldah's prophetic ministry coincided with the final period of Hebrew Israelite independence before the Babylonian exile. Her oracles about coming judgment and conditional mercy provided theological frameworks that Hebrew Israelite communities would carry with them into exile and diaspora. Her emphasis on God's faithfulness to those who humble themselves and seek His face became central to Hebrew Israelite identity during centuries of dispersion. Alternative perspectives suggest that Huldah's influence on Hebrew Israeli identity extended beyond the immediate historical context of Josiah's reforms. Her prophetic authority may have shaped how scattered Hebrew Israelite communities understood their relationship with God, their responsibilities to maintain covenant faithfulness, and their hope for eventual restoration. These themes resonate strongly with African American religious traditions that emphasize divine deliverance and ultimate justice. The scholarly authority that Huldah exercised in validating sacred texts established precedents for women's roles in preserving and interpreting Hebrew Israelite religious traditions. This tradition of female spiritual scholarship may have been particularly important in diaspora communities where maintaining cultural identity required dedicated preservation of religious knowledge and practices. Her example provided legitimacy for women who served as keepers of Hebrew Israelite traditions in scattered communities. Beyond the major figures of Miriam, Deborah, and biblical history mentions other women prophets whose roles illuminate the broader tradition of female spiritual leadership among the Hebrew Israelites. The prophetess Noadiah mentioned in Nehemiah 6:14, though described as opposing Nehemiah's reforms, demonstrates that women continued to exercise prophetic authority during the post-exilic period. Anna the prophetess in Luke 2:36 represents the continuation of this tradition into the New Testament period. What fascinates me most about these additional prophetesses is how they reveal the ongoing presence of women's prophetic voices throughout Hebrew Israelite history. Joel 2:28 predicts that in the end times, God will pour out His Spirit on all flesh, and both men and women will prophesy. This prophecy suggests that the tradition of women prophets among the Hebrew Israelites was not merely a historical phenomenon but a preview of end-time spiritual realities that we may be witnessing today. The global nature of Joel's prophecy aligns perfectly with evidence for Hebrew Israelite diaspora communities where women continued to exercise spiritual leadership roles. Alternative scholars see these minor prophetesses as evidence of Hebrew Israelite influence in scattered communities that maintained their cultural identity while living among other peoples. The tradition of female prophetic authority may have been particularly important in communities that faced cultural assimilation pressures. For African American viewers, these stories of women prophets celebrate ancestral voices that have been marginalized in traditional biblical history narratives. The recognition of women's prophetic authority within Hebrew Israelite communities provides historical precedent for the powerful tradition of female spiritual leadership that has characterized African American religious experience. These connections suggest cultural continuities that may reflect deeper Hebrew Israelite heritage connections. The prophetic tradition established by these Hebrew Israelite women created expectations for female spiritual authority that would influence religious communities throughout history. Their examples of combining prophetic insight with practical leadership provided models that continue to inspire women in various cultural contexts. The universal themes of divine calling, spiritual authority, and prophetic courage transcend specific ethnic or cultural boundaries while maintaining their roots in Hebrew Israelite biblical history. My friend, let me share some of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries that have revolutionized our understanding of women's roles in ancient Israel. In my decades of studying these findings, I've been absolutely amazed by how physical evidence confirms what the Hebrew Scriptures have always declared about women's spiritual authority among the Hebrew Israelites. The excavations at Shiloh, one of the most significant worship sites in ancient Israel, have uncovered female figurines dating to approximately 1200 BC. Mainstream biblical archaeology typically interprets these artifacts as fertility idols associated with Canaanite religious practices, but alternative scholars propose a fascinating connection to Hebrew Israelite prophetesses like Deborah, who held court nearby according to Judges 4:5. What absolutely stunned me about these Shiloh discoveries is how they suggest women's prominent spiritual roles at the very site where the tabernacle was established and where Samuel received his prophetic calling. These figurines aren't crude fertility symbols but carefully crafted representations of women in positions of spiritual authority. The artistic sophistication and ritual context suggest these artifacts commemorate actual female spiritual leaders rather than pagan deities. The geographic proximity of Shiloh to Deborah's judgment seat creates compelling connections between archaeological evidence and biblical history. If these figurines represent commemorations of Hebrew Israelite prophetesses, they would provide physical evidence for the spiritual authority that women wielded in ancient Israel's religious centers. This interpretation aligns with biblical prophecy passages like Joel 2:28 that promise both men and women will prophesy in God's plan. For African American audiences, these archaeological discoveries celebrate the agency and spiritual power of their potential Hebrew Israelite ancestors. The evidence suggests that women in ancient Israel weren't marginalized figures but central participants in the religious and spiritual life of God's chosen people. These findings validate that the tradition of strong female spiritual leadership that has characterized African American religious experience throughout history. The debate surrounding these artifacts reflects broader tensions between mainstream archaeology and alternative interpretations of Hebrew Israelite history. While conventional scholars emphasize Canaanite influences, alternative researchers see evidence for distinctive Hebrew Israelite traditions that may have influenced scattered communities across the ancient world. The physical evidence demands serious consideration of women's roles in ways that challenge traditional assumptions about ancient gender hierarchies. Archaeological discoveries of seals and inscriptions throughout ancient Israel have revealed evidence of women holding significant administrative and possibly prophetic roles. The famous Maiden of Israel seal dating to the 8th century BC suggests that women possessed official authority that extended beyond domestic spheres. These inscriptions challenge assumptions about gender roles in Hebrew Israelite society and provide physical evidence for women's public participation in religious and political life. What fascinates me most about these seal discoveries is how they coincide chronologically with the ministries of prophetesses like Huldah. The 8th and 7th centuries BC represent periods when Hebrew Israelite women wielded documented prophetic authority, and the archaeological evidence suggests this spiritual leadership was part of broader patterns of female participation in public life. These connections between biblical history and physical evidence create compelling arguments for women's prominence in Hebrew Israelite culture. The Hebrew inscriptions on these seals demonstrate that women possessed literacy and administrative skills that would have been essential for preserving and transmitting religious traditions. This evidence supports alternative theories about women's roles in maintaining Hebrew Israelite cultural identity, now particularly in diaspora communities where cultural preservation required dedicated effort and specialized knowledge. Mainstream biblical scholarship tends to interpret these inscriptions as evidence of exceptional individuals rather than broader patterns of female authority. However, alternative perspectives suggest that these discoveries represent surviving examples of more widespread traditions of women's leadership that may have been systematically suppressed or marginalized in historical records. The physical evidence provides glimpses into Hebrew Israelite cultural realities that textual sources may have obscured. The prophetic connections become particularly intriguing when we consider how Micah 6:4 female leadership alongside male authority in God's deliverance of the Hebrew Israelites. The archaeological evidence suggests that this biblical testimony reflects actual cultural patterns rather than exceptional circumstances. These findings support interpretations that see women's spiritual authority as integral to Hebrew Israelite identity rather than marginal to it. One of the most significant challenges facing biblical archaeology in relation to women prophets is the limited nature of inscriptional evidence and the patriarchal biases that influenced ancient record-keeping practices. The Hebrew Israelite societies, like most ancient cultures, produced written records primarily from male perspectives, which means that women's contributions were often minimized or omitted entirely from historical documentation. What troubles me most about these limitations is how they have shaped modern interpretations of Hebrew Israelite history. Mainstream scholars rely heavily on textual sources like 2 Kings 22 for understanding women's roles, but these sources may represent only a fraction of women's actual influence in Hebrew Israelite society. The archaeological evidence suggests much broader patterns of female authority that textual sources failed to adequately document. The search for prophetic symbols and artifacts related to women requires alternative methodological approaches that look beyond traditional archaeological categories. Ancient prophecy passages like Joel 2:28 suggest that women's spiritual roles were divinely ordained rather than culturally exceptional, which means archaeological evidence may be more widespread than conventional interpretation acknowledges. The challenges of identifying prophetesses through archaeological evidence reflect broader problems in understanding Hebrew Israelite diaspora communities. If women played crucial roles in preserving and transmitting Hebrew Israelite culture among scattered populations, their influence may be archaeologically visible in ways that haven't been properly recognized or interpreted. This possibility opens new avenues for understanding the global reach of Hebrew Israelite cultural influence. The controversy surrounding these interpretive challenges reveals how archaeological methodology itself can be influenced by contemporary assumptions about gender roles and cultural authority. The physical evidence demands more nuanced approaches that consider women's potential roles in shaping Hebrew Israelite identity across geographic and temporal boundaries. These methodological questions have profound implications for understanding the historical development of Hebrew Israelite communities. Extra-biblical sources, particularly texts discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, provide additional evidence for women's spiritual leadership roles that extend beyond the canonical Hebrew scriptures. These sectarian documents mention female spiritual leaders and prophetic figures whose existence suggests broader traditions of women's religious authority among Hebrew Israelite communities during the Second Temple period. What excites me most about these extra-biblical discoveries is how they confirm the continuity of women's prophetic roles throughout Hebrew Israelite history. The Dead Sea Scrolls represent alternative Hebrew Israelite communities that maintained distinctive religious practices, and their documentation of female spiritual leadership suggests that women's authority was recognized across different Hebrew Israelite sectarian groups, rather than being limited to specific historical periods. The alternative interpretations of these extra-biblical sources propose connections between documented female spiritual leaders and broader patterns of Hebrew Israelite influence among diaspora communities. If these women represented established traditions of female prophetic authority, their influence may have extended to scattered Hebrew Israelite populations that maintained cultural connections across geographic boundaries. For African American viewers, these extra-biblical discoveries celebrate the wisdom and spiritual authority of their potential Hebrew Israelite ancestors. The documentation of women's religious leadership in these alternative sources provides historical precedent for the powerful tradition of female spiritual guidance that has characterized African American religious experience. These connections suggest cultural continuities that may reflect deeper heritage relationships. The scholarly debate about these extra-biblical sources reflects broader tensions between mainstream biblical scholarship and alternative interpretations of Hebrew Israelite history. While conventional scholars emphasize the sectarian nature of these documents, alternative researchers see evidence for authentic Hebrew Israelite traditions that may have influenced scattered communities throughout the ancient world. The physical evidence of these texts demands serious consideration of women's roles in ways that challenge traditional assumptions about Hebrew Israelite religious development. In my decades of studying ancient populations and their migrations, nothing has been more revolutionary than the recent advances in DNA analysis that are literally rewriting our understanding of the Hebrew Israelite diaspora. The genetic evidence emerging from laboratories around the world is confirming what biblical prophecy has always declared about the global scattering of God's chosen people, and the implications for understanding women's roles in this dispersion are absolutely staggering. The most compelling dawn evidence comes from the Lemba people of southern Africa, whose genetic markers have stunned researchers worldwide. When geneticists analyze Y chromosome markers from Lemba men, they discovered that a substantial percentage carry the Cohen modal haplotype, a genetic signature specifically associated with the Jewish priesthood. This isn't statistical noise or coincidental similarity. This is direct genetic evidence linking contemporary African populations to ancient Hebrew Israelite communities. What absolutely fascinates me about the Lemba discoveries is how they validate oral traditions that have been maintained for centuries. The Lemba people have always claimed descent from Hebrew ancestors who migrated to Africa, and their cultural practices, including circumcision, dietary restriction, and Sabbath observance, align remarkably with Hebrew Israelite traditions. The DNA evidence now provides scientific confirmation for these long-standing cultural claims. The genetic analysis reveals that Lembali chromosomes clearly divide into Semitic and Bantu lineages, indicating genuine admixture between Middle Eastern and African populations. This pattern perfectly matches what we would expect if Hebrew Israelite migrants had intermarried with local African populations while maintaining their cultural identity. The genetic evidence suggests multiple founding events rather than a single migration, which aligns with biblical prophecy about the gradual scattering of Hebrew Israelite tribes. Mainstream scholars often attribute these genetic connections to ancient trade relationships or Islamic expansion, but alternative theories align them directly with biblical prophecy passages like Hosea 9:17 that describe Hebrew Israelites as wanderers among the nations. The genetic evidence provides scientific validation for prophetic descriptions of global Hebrew Israelite dispersion that preceded known historical migrations by centuries. For African American audiences, these genetic discoveries celebrate a proud heritage that connects contemporary communities to the ancient Hebrew Israelites. The scientific evidence suggests that African populations may have preserved Hebrew Israelite genetic and cultural markers that were lost or suppressed in other regions. These findings provide biological confirmation for cultural and spiritual connections that have been maintained through oral traditions and religious practices. The genetic studies revealing Semitic markers in diverse populations extend far beyond African communities to include European and Native American groups whose Hebrew Israelite connections challenge conventional historical narratives. Recent DNA analyses have identified potential Semitic markers in populations ranging from Celtic communities in Britain and Ireland to certain Native American tribes in North America. What strikes me most powerfully about these widespread genetic connections is how they align with ancient prophecy passages like Isaiah 11:12 that predict Hebrew Israelite dispersion to the four corners of the earth. The genetic evidence suggests that Hebrew Israelite influence was truly global in scope, reaching populations and regions that mainstream biblical scholarship has never considered in relation to ancient Hebrew migrations. The European genetic evidence is particularly intriguing because it appears in populations known for megalithic construction and astronomical knowledge that parallels Hebrew Israelite cultural traditions. The Celtic populations of Britain and Ireland show Middle Eastern genetic markers that predate known historical contact, and these same regions contain stone circles and monuments that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics and sacred geometry. The Native American genetic connections remain controversial, but some studies have identified mitochondrial lineages and Y chromosome markers that suggest pre-Columbian contact between the Americas and Middle Eastern populations. These findings align with alternative interpretations of Hebrew Israelite global influence that extend beyond conventional geographical boundaries. The implications of these genetic discoveries for understanding women's roles in Hebrew Israelite diaspora communities are profound. If Hebrew Israelite cultural influence was truly global, as the genetic evidence suggests, then women's prophetic traditions and spiritual leadership roles may have been transmitted across continents and preserved in scattered communities through female lineages and cultural transmission. The limitations of DNA evidence must be acknowledged honestly, even as we celebrate the remarkable discoveries that genetic analysis has provided. Small psi, complex migration patterns, and the degradation of ancient genetic material all create challenges for drawing definitive conclusions about ancient populations and their movements. The scientific methodology requires careful interpretation and conservative conclusions. What concerns me most about these limitations is how they can be used to dismiss legitimate genetic connections that challenge conventional historical narratives. Mainstream scholars appropriately caution against over-interpreting genetic data, but alternative researchers argue that the patterns are too consistent and widespread to be explained by chance or contamination. The genetic evidence demands serious consideration even when it challenges established interpretations. The complexity of human migration patterns means that genetic markers can be shared between populations through ancient common ancestry rather than recent contact. The presence of Semitic markers in diverse populations doesn't necessarily prove recent Hebrew Israelite influence, but it does suggest possible connections that merit further investigation and analysis. The challenge of distinguishing between different types of genetic connections requires sophisticated analytical techniques and large sample sizes that aren't always available. The genetic evidence provides tantalizing glimpses of possible Hebrew Israelite connections, But definitive proof requires additional research and corroborating evidence from archaeological and historical sources. Despite these limitations, the convergence of genetic evidence with archaeological discoveries, cultural practices, and oral traditions creates compelling arguments for Hebrew Israelite influence that extends far beyond conventional geographical and temporal boundaries. The genetic data provides scientific frameworks for understanding cultural connections that have been maintained through non-genetic transmission mechanisms. The prophetic implications of DNA evidence linking modern populations to ancient Israel are absolutely staggering when we consider passages like Joel 2:28 that predict women prophesying in the end times. If Hebrew Israeli genetic markers are indeed present in populations worldwide, then the prophetic tradition of women's spiritual authority may have been preserved and transmitted across global diaspora communities. What moves me most deeply about these genetic discoveries is how they align with Ezekiel 37's vision of scattered bones coming together to form a living army. The modern ability to identify Hebrew Israeli genetic markers in diverse populations may represent the beginning of prophetic reunification that has been foretold for millennia. The genetic evidence provides scientific confirmation for spiritual realities that transcend conventional understanding. The connection between DNA evidence and women's prophetic legacy becomes particularly significant when we consider how genetic markers are transmitted through both paternal and maternal lineages. The mitochondrial DNA that passes exclusively through female lines may preserve evidence of Hebrew Israelite women's influence on diaspora communities in ways that have been overlooked by traditional historical analysis. Alternative scholars suggest that the genetic markers associated with Hebrew Israelite populations may reflect the influence of prophetesses and spiritual leaders who guided scattered communities and maintained cultural identity through female-centered transmission mechanisms. The genetic evidence provides scientific validation for women's roles in preserving and transmitting Hebrew Israelite heritage across geographic and temporal boundaries. The end-time significance of these genetic discoveries becomes clear when we consider how modern technology is making possible identification and potential reunification of scattered Hebrew Israelite communities. The same scientific techniques that reveal genetic connections also provide tools for restoring cultural and spiritual relationships that have been separated for centuries. The genetic evidence suggests that we may be witnessing the beginning of prophetic fulfillment that will culminate in the ultimate restoration of God's chosen people. My friend, let me share something that has profoundly moved my heart throughout decades of research into Hebrew Israelite identity. The stories of Miriam, Deborah, and Huldah don't just belong to ancient history. They speak directly to contemporary cultural identity movements, particularly within African American communities, in ways that bridge thousands of years of hidden history and spiritual continuity. The narrative parallels between Hebrew Israelite women prophets and African American experiences of resilience, spiritual leadership, and divine calling are absolutely extraordinary. One I read about Miriam leading the Hebrew Israelites in celebratory worship after their deliverance from Egyptian bondage. I'm struck by how this mirrors the tradition of African American women who have served as spiritual anchors during periods of oppression and struggle. What absolutely fascinates me about these connections is how Micah 6:4 places Miriam alongside Moses and Aaron as one of three leaders whom God sent to deliver his people. This divine recognition of women's spiritual authority resonates powerfully with African American religious traditions where women have consistently provided prophetic leadership, moral, and spiritual strength for their communities. The call and response pattern of Miriam's prophetic song in Exodus 15:21 shares remarkable similarities with African American worship traditions that have been maintained for generations. Alternative scholars suggest that these cultural parallels may reflect deeper heritage connections that were preserved through oral traditions and religious practices rather than written documentation. The spiritual Hebrew Israelite worship patterns may have been transmitted through cultural mechanisms that transcend conventional historical analysis. Biblical prophecy passages like 2:28 promise that God will pour out his Spirit on all flesh, and both men and women will prophesy. This prophetic vision of gender-inclusive spiritual authority aligns perfectly with African American religious experience where women have consistently exercised prophetic gifts, pastoral leadership, and spiritual guidance that has sustained communities through centuries of challenge and transformation. The warrior prophetess tradition embodied by Deborah provides particularly powerful inspiration for African American women who have fought for justice, equality, and spiritual authenticity. Deborah's combination of prophetic authority with practical leadership offers a biblical model for women who find themselves called to positions of community leadership and social transformation. The scholarly authority that Huldah exercised in validating sacred texts and providing divine interpretation speaks directly to African American traditions of women serving as keepers of cultural knowledge, religious wisdom, and spiritual discernment. Her role in sparking religious reform through prophetic authority provides biblical precedent for women's involvement in movements of spiritual and social renewal. These connections between Hebrew Israelite women prophets and African American heritage celebrate ancestral voices that have been marginalized in traditional biblical history narratives. The recognition of women's prophetic authority within Hebrew Israelite communities provides historical validation for the powerful tradition of female spiritual leadership that has characterized African American religious experience throughout history. While the stories of Hebrew Israelite women prophets resonate particularly powerfully with African American experiences, their universal themes of courage, faith, and divine calling transcend ethnic and cultural boundaries. The prophetic authority exercised by Miriam, Deborah, and Huldah speaks to women of all backgrounds who have felt called to spiritual leadership and social transformation. What moves me most deeply about these universal connections is how biblical history demonstrates that God's calling of women to prophetic ministry isn't limited by cultural or ethnic boundaries. Deborah's leadership of ancient Israel involved military strategy, judicial decision-making, and spiritual guidance that required skills and authority that any leader would need regardless of their background or cultural context. The prophetic tradition established by these Hebrew Israelite women created expectations for female spiritual authority that have influenced religious communities throughout history. Ancient prophecy passages like Joel 2:28 promise that divine revelation will be poured out on all flesh, suggesting that women's prophetic gifts are part of God's universal plan for spiritual communication and guidance. Alternative perspectives suggest that the influence of Hebrew Israelite women prophets may have shaped global cultures through diaspora communities that maintained their spiritual traditions while adapting to local contexts. The themes of divine deliverance, prophetic authority, and spiritual leadership that characterized these women's ministries appear in various cultural and religious traditions worldwide. The universal appeal of these prophetic women's stories lies in their demonstration that spiritual authority comes from divine calling rather than human social structures. Their examples provide inspiration for women in diverse cultural contexts who feel called to spiritual leadership but face resistance from traditional hierarchies that limit women's religious authority. The courage and faith demonstrated by Hebrew Israelite women prophets offer timeless models for spiritual leadership that transcend specific historical or cultural circumstances. Their willingness to speak divine truth to political power, to provide spiritual guidance during times of crisis, and to maintain faith despite opposition provides inspiration for contemporary women facing similar challenges. Modern Hebrew Israelite movements, particularly those within African American communities, draw significant inspiration from the examples of women prophets in biblical history. These contemporary movements see figures like Miriam, Deborah, and Huldah as ancestral models for women's spiritual authority and cultural leadership within Hebrew Israelite identity frameworks. What excites me most about these modern movements is how they validate women's prophetic gifts and spiritual authority in ways that align with biblical prophecy about end-time spiritual outpouring. The recognition of women's divine calling within Hebrew Israelite communities reflects broader patterns of spiritual awakening that may be fulfilling ancient prophetic promises about the last days. The emphasis on cultural identity and heritage connection within these movements provides frameworks for understanding how Hebrew Israelite traditions may have been preserved and transmitted through diaspora communities. Biblical prophecy passages like Ezekiel 37 describe the reunification of scattered tribes, and contemporary identity movements may represent early stages of this prophetic fulfillment. Mainstream scholars tend to view these movements as modern constructions rather than authentic connections to ancient Hebrew Israelite communities. However, alternative perspectives suggest that these cultural and spiritual movements may reflect genuine heritage connections that were maintained through oral traditions, relictuses, and cultural patterns rather than written documentation. The celebration of women's prophetic authority within modern Hebrew Israelite movements challenges traditional religious hierarchies and creates space for female spiritual leadership that aligns with biblical precedents. These contemporary expressions of women's prophetic gifts may represent the fulfillment of Joel 2:28's promise that both men and women will prophesy in the end times. The role of women in preserving and transmitting Hebrew Israelite cultural identity becomes particularly significant when we consider how these movements maintain connections to ancient traditions while adapting to contemporary contexts. Women's spiritual leadership within these communities often involves teaching cultural practices, maintaining religious observances, and providing prophetic guidance that connects modern believers to their ancestral heritage. The legacy of Hebrew Israelite women prophets creates bridges between biblical history and contemporary geopolitical realities in ways that illuminate end-times prophecy and cultural identity formation. Ancient prophecy passages like Isaiah 11:12 predict the regathering of scattered Hebrew Israelite communities from the four corners of the earth, and modern identity movements may represent early stages of this prophetic fulfillment. What absolutely amazes me about these contemporary connections is how they align with prophetic timelines that suggest we're living in the end times period when scattered Hebrew Israelite communities will be restored to their cultural and spiritual identity. The recognition of women's prophetic authority within these movements reflects broader patterns of spiritual awakening that may be preparing God's people for ultimate prophetic fulfillment. The geographic scope of modern Hebrew Israelite identity movement spans continents and cultures, creating global networks of communities that maintain connections to ancient Hebrew traditions while adapting to local contexts. Women's spiritual leadership within these diverse communities often involves cross-cultural communication, heritage education, and prophetic guidance that transcends national and ethnic boundaries. For African American viewers, these contemporary connections affirm ancestral ties to Hebrew Israelite heritage while providing frameworks for understanding their community's spiritual traditions and cultural practices. The recognition of women's prophetic authority within these movements validates the powerful tradition of female spiritual leadership that has characterized African American religious experience throughout history. The broader implications of these cultural identity connections extend beyond specific ethnic or religious communities to include anyone who feels called to explore their spiritual heritage and prophetic destiny. The examples of Hebrew Israelite women prophets provide timeless models for spiritual leadership that speak to contemporary believers regardless of their background or cultural context. The end-time significance of these identity movements becomes clear when we consider how they may be fulfilling ancient prophetic promises about the restoration of God's chosen people. The recognition of women's prophetic authority within these communities aligns with Joel 2:28's promise that divine revelation will be poured out on all flesh, including both men and women, in the last day. As we stand here in 2025, I believe we are witnessing the most extraordinary convergence of ancient biblical prophecy and contemporary geopolitical events that has ever occurred in human history. The Hebrew Israelite women prophets, whose voices we've been exploring, didn't just speak to their immediate historical contexts. They delivered prophetic revelations that are finding their ultimate fulfillment in our current moment. The establishment of Israel in 1948 represents one of the most significant prophetic fulfillments in modern history, and the role of women prophets like Huldah in foreshadowing restoration themes takes on new significance in this context. 36:24 promises that God will gather His people from all countries and bring them back to their own land. And we've witnessed this prophecy being fulfilled in real time through the return of Hebrew Israelite communities to their ancestral homeland. What absolutely stunned me about Israel's rebirth is how it aligns with the prophetic timeline that the Hebrew Israelite women prophets established through their oracles. Huldah's emphasis on God's faithfulness to those who humble themselves and seek His face provides a theological framework for understanding how divine restoration operates through historical processes. Her prophecy about judgment followed by restoration mirrors the pattern of Hebrew Israelite exile and return that culminated in 1948. The themes of divine deliverance and national restoration that characterized the ministries of Hebrew Israelite women prophets resonate powerfully with African American experiences of struggle and hope for justice. The parallel between Hebrew Israelite return from exile and African American aspirations for full equality and recognition creates cultural connections that transcend specific ethnic boundaries while honoring particular heritage claims. Mainstream scholars tend to view Israel's establishment as primarily a political response to the Holocaust and European antisemitism, but alternative perspectives recognize it as the fulfillment of ancient biblical prophecy that was preserved and transmitted through Hebrew Israelite communities worldwide. The prophetic significance of this event extends beyond immediate political circumstances to encompass cosmic spiritual realities that were foretold millennia ago. The role of women in Israel's modern development reflects the prophetic tradition established by Hebrew Israelite women prophets in biblical history. Contemporary Israeli women have served as prime ministers, Supreme Court justice, and military leaders in ways that echo the spiritual and political authority exercised by figures like Deborah. This continuity suggests that women's leadership roles are integral to Hebrew Israelite identity rather than exceptional historical circumstances. The contemporary migration of African Jewish communities to Israel represents one of the most remarkable fulfillments of biblical prophecy that we're witnessing today. Jews, known as Bezrael, have maintained Hebrew traditions for centuries in isolation, and their return to Israel fulfills Isaiah 11:11's prophecy about God recovering the remnant of his people from Cush and other distant lands. What moves me most deeply about these African migrations is how they validate the global scope of Hebrew Israelite influence that women prophets like Miriam may have helped establish through their spiritual authority. The Beta Israel communities preserve Hebrew cultural practices, religious observances, and oral traditions that demonstrate remarkable continuity with ancient Hebrew Israelite identity despite centuries of geographic separation. The DNA evidence supporting Hebrew Israelite ancestry among various African populations provides scientific validation for these migration patterns and cultural connections. The genetic markers found in communities like the Lemba people of southern Africa align with the prophetic vision of Hebrew Israelite dispersion that women prophets helped interpret and guide through their spiritual leadership. Alternative scholars suggest that the return of African Hebrew Israelite communities to Israel represents more than political migration. It may be part of the prophetic regathering described in passages like Ezekiel 37, where scattered bones come together to form a living army. The role of women in preserving and transmitting Hebrew Israelite cultural identity within these communities reflects the prophetic tradition established by biblical women prophets. The celebration of African Hebrew Israelite heritage within contemporary identity movements creates cultural bridges between ancient biblical prophecy and modern geopolitical realities. The recognition of women's spiritual authority within these communities aligns with Joel 2:28's promise that both men and women will prophesy in the end times, suggesting that we may be witnessing the beginning of ultimate prophetic fulfillment. The fulfillment of Joel 2:28's prophecy about women prophesying in the end times is becoming increasingly visible in contemporary spiritual movements worldwide. Female spiritual leaders across various cultural and religious contexts are reporting prophetic visions, divine revelations, and spiritual authority that echoes the ministries of Hebrew Israelite women prophets in biblical history. What excites me most about these contemporary prophetic phenomena is how they transcend traditional religious and cultural boundaries while maintaining connections to Hebrew Israelite prophetic traditions. Women in African American communities, European and global spiritual movements are experiencing prophetic gifts that align with the biblical precedents established by figures like Miriam, Deborah, and Huldah. The global scope of these prophetic manifestations suggests that we may be witnessing the beginning of the end times spiritual outpouring that Hebrew Israelite women prophets helped foreshadow through their ministries. The themes of divine deliverance, spiritual authority, and prophetic revelation that characterize their oracles are appearing in contemporary spiritual movements worldwide. Alternative scholars see these modern prophetic phenomena as evidence of Hebrew Israelite influence that was preserved and transmitted through diaspora communities. The spiritual authority exercised by contemporary women prophets may reflect cultural and religious patterns that were established by Hebrew Israelite women prophets and maintained through oral traditions and religious practices. The recognition of women's prophetic authority within diverse contemporary movements challenges traditional religious hierarchies and creates space for female spiritual leadership that aligns with biblical precedents. These developments may represent the fulfillment of ancient prophetic promises about the restoration of God's chosen people and the ultimate establishment of His kingdom on earth. The convergence of prophetic spiritual phenomena with geopolitical events related to Israel and Hebrew Israelite identity creates a powerful framework for understanding end-times prophecy. The role of women in these contemporary developments reflects the prophetic tradition as established by Hebrew Israelite women prophets and suggests that their spiritual legacy continues to influence world events. The current geopolitical tensions surrounding Jerusalem and Israel align remarkably with biblical prophecy passages that Hebrew Israelite women prophets helped establish through their oracles. Zechariah 3 predicts that Jerusalem will become a burdensome stone for all nations. And we're witnessing this prophecy being fulfilled through contemporary Middle Eastern conflicts and international diplomatic challenges. What concerns me most about these geopolitical developments is how they mirror the prophetic warnings that Hebrew Israelite women prophets delivered about divine judgment and restoration. Huldah's oracle in 2 Kings 22 warned about coming judgment while promising mercy for those who humble themselves before God. And this pattern appears to be repeating in contemporary international relations. The role of women in addressing these geopolitical challenges reflects the prophetic tradition established by Hebrew Israelite women prophets who provided spiritual guidance during times of national crisis. Contemporary female leaders in Israel and other nations are exercising authority that echoes the spiritual and political leadership demonstrated by figures like Deborah and Huldah. The global nature of contemporary conflicts over Jerusalem's status suggests that we may be approaching the end-time scenario described in Zechariah 12, where all nations will be gathered against Jerusalem. The prophetic warnings delivered by Hebrew Israelite women prophets about divine judgment and restoration provide theological frameworks for understanding these developments. The connection between contemporary geopolitical events and ancient biblical prophecy creates opportunities for spiritual awakening and prophetic fulfillment that transcend political boundaries. The legacy of Hebrew Israelite women prophets provides guidance for navigating these challenging times while maintaining faith in God's ultimate plan for restoration and redemption. As we reach the conclusion of this remarkable journey through the hidden history of Hebrew Israelite women prophets, I want to leave you with something that has burned in my heart throughout decades of research. These forgotten voices weren't just speaking to their ancient audiences. They were delivering prophetic revelations that speak directly to our current moment in end-times history. The synthesis of evidence we've explored today, from archaeological evidence to Dan evidence to ancient prophecy, reveals a complex tapestry of Hebrew Israelite influence that extends far beyond traditional biblical history narratives. The women prophets whose voices we've recovered through this investigation represent more than historical curiosities. They were divine instruments who helped shape the global Hebrew Israelite diaspora and whose spiritual legacy continues to influence contemporary identity movements and prophetic fulfillment. What absolutely moves me about these discoveries is how they validate both African American heritage claims and universal spiritual truths that transcend ethnic boundaries. The recognition of women's prophetic authority within Hebrew Israelite communities provides historical precedent for the powerful tradition of female spiritual leadership that has characterized various cultural and religious contexts throughout history. The convergence of genetic evidence, archaeological discoveries, and prophetic interpretation creates compelling arguments for Hebrew Israelite influence that was preserved and transmitted through diaspora communities worldwide. The role of women prophets in maintaining cultural identity and spiritual authority within these scattered communities reflects the prophetic tradition established by biblical figures like Miriam, Deborah, and Huldah. For African American viewers, these discoveries celebrate ancestral ties to Hebrew Israelite heritage while providing frameworks for understanding their community's spiritual traditions and cultural practices. The scientific validation of genetic connections between African populations and ancient Hebrew Israelite communities supports claims that have been maintained through oral traditions and religious observances for generations. The broader implications of these findings extend beyond specific ethnic or religious communities to include anyone who feels called to explore their spiritual heritage and prophetic destiny. The examples of Hebrew Israelite women prophets provide timeless models for spiritual leadership that speak to contemporary believers regardless of their background or cultural context. The spiritual legacy of Hebrew Israelite women prophets continues to inspire contemporary movements and prophetic fulfillment in ways that bridge ancient biblical prophecy and modern geopolitical realities. Their oracles about divine deliverance, spiritual authority, and national restoration find ongoing fulfillment through events like Israel's rebirth, African Hebrew Israelite migrations, and global spiritual awakening. What strikes me most powerfully about their prophetic legacy is how it demonstrates God's consistent use of women as vessels for divine revelation and spiritual guidance. The prophetic tradition established by Hebrew Israelite women prophets creates expectations for female spiritual authority that continue to influence religious communities and cultural movements worldwide. The themes of resilience, spiritual strength, and divine calling that characterize their ministries provide inspiration for contemporary women who feel called to prophetic ministry and spiritual leadership. Their examples demonstrate that spiritual authority comes from divine calling rather than human social structures, offering encouragement for women facing resistance from traditional hierarchies. The end-time significance of their prophetic legacy becomes clear when we consider how Joel 2:28's promise about women prophesying in the last days is being fulfilled through contemporary spiritual movements. The recognition of women's prophetic authority within diverse religious and cultural contexts may represent the beginning of ultimate prophetic fulfillment that will culminate in the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. Now, I need you to understand that this research isn't just academic exploration. We're living in the end times period when these ancient prophecies are finding their ultimate fulfillment. The Hebrew Israelite women prophets whose voices we've recovered through this investigation delivered oracles that speak directly to our current moment in prophetic history. The evidence we've examined today demands a response from every viewer who has been touched by these revelations. Whether you're of African American heritage exploring potential Hebrew Israelite connections, or you're from any other background seeking to understand your place in God's prophetic plan, these discoveries have implications for your spiritual journey and cultural identity. I want to challenge you to engage with this material in ways that go beyond passive consumption. Research these connections for yourself. Examine the biblical prophecy passages we've discussed. Investigate the archaeological evidence and Dan evidence that supports Hebrew Israelite global influence. Most importantly, consider how God might be calling you to participate in the prophetic fulfillment that these ancient women prophets helped establish. The questions we've raised today about women's roles in Hebrew Israelite history and contemporary identity movements require community discussion and ongoing research. I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments section below. Do you believe women prophets shaped Hebrew Israelite diaspora communities? Have you experienced prophetic gifts or spiritual authority that align with these biblical precedents? What connections do you see between ancient biblical prophecy and contemporary geopolitical events? Your participation in this dialogue is crucial for advancing our understanding of these hidden history connections and their relevance to end times prophecy. The Hebrew Israelite women prophets whose voices we've recovered through this investigation spoke to communities of believers who were actively engaged in spiritual and cultural preservation. We need that same level of community engagement today. Subscribe to our channel for more explorations of biblical secrets and prophetic revelations that connect ancient Hebrew Israelite history to contemporary spiritual awakening. Take our interactive quiz to test your knowledge of biblical prophecy and women's prophetic roles. Share this video with friends and family members who might be interested in exploring their spiritual heritage and prophetic destiny. As we look toward the future, the prophetic legacy of Hebrew Israelite women prophets invites us to participate in the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan for His chosen people. Biblical prophecy passages like Zechariah 14:4 point to a climactic return of divine authority to Jerusalem, and the spiritual awakening we're witnessing today may be preparing the way for these final prophetic events. The Hebrew Israelite women prophets whose voices we've recovered through this investigation were not just historical figures. They were prophetic pioneers who established spiritual traditions and cultural patterns that continue to influence world events and individual spiritual journeys. Their legacy calls us to embrace our own prophetic destiny and to participate in the ongoing fulfillment of God's plan for humanity. The time is short, my friend. The stakes have never been higher. The prophetic timeline established by Hebrew Israelite women prophets is reaching its climax, and you have the opportunity to be part of this ultimate spiritual and cultural restoration. May God bless you as you explore these connections, and may you find the courage to embrace your calling in these last days. The Hebrew Israelite women prophets, whose voices we've celebrated today, would want nothing more than for their spiritual legacy to inspire contemporary believers to seek God's face, to embrace their prophetic destiny, and to participate in the ultimate restoration of His chosen people. Their ancient oracles continue to speak, and their prophetic authority continues to influence world events as we approach the end times fulfillment of God's eternal plan.